this morning to everybody. Thanks for being here. For those of you joining us online, I always invite you to check us out online. You can visit our website, which is ufcucc.org. And if anybody wants to be on our email list as well, shoot us an email at ufcucc@gmail.com, and we'll make sure you get any announcements of activities and things going on here at church. So I'm going to start with a few announcements that I know about, and then if there's others, please feel free to share. So the first one, we have started our Wednesday evening Bible studies. It's at 7 p.m. Our next one is next week, not this coming week, but the week after,
The
right?
20th.
The 20th. Again, it's 7 p.m. and it's here. We are studying 1 Corinthians. So everybody is welcome to join. You don't have to be at all of them. If you can only come to a few, that's fine too. So, the other announcement this evening, there is the Doctrine of Discovery film that will be held. We're doing this in partnership with the Buffalo Presbyterian Church. It is at 7 p.m. tonight.
7 o'clock, correct?
So, and they'll have some refreshments and stuff. We'll watch that film together, and I believe have some discussion and stuff as well. So.
Discussion afterwards. We are still looking if anybody is coming and is interested. Cookies or bars would be appreciated. So.
Great. And then a couple of youth events that I know about. So today our youth are going to the Fall Harvest Orchard. It's in between Montrose and Delano. Everybody is welcome, even the young at heart. So you don't have to be a youth to come. You can be young at heart as well. But we will be doing that this afternoon from 2 to 4. And then the one other youth announcement, we have confirmation class that begins this Wednesday, the 13th. We're doing this with a few other churches across the UCC conference. There are a few churches down in the cities. It is at 6 p.m., right, Ash?
It starts, 6:15.
6:15. So, and we will do carpool, so if there's anybody, again, that wants to join in and have youth that would like to participate, please send us an email, and Ash and I will help coordinate to get carpools for each week that we're having that program. So, those are all the announcements I know about. Any others that I missed?
We're doing our Adopt a Highway ditch cleaning in Buffalo next Saturday, this coming Saturday. We'll meet at 9 a.m. in the parking lot at Moon Donuts on Highway 55. We have the stretch of 55 that runs right through town. So we have vests and bags. It's recommended that you have gloves and, of course, sturdy shoes for doing that. So
Great. Any other announcements? No? Okay, well then let's go ahead and if you guys will stand with me, and we'll start with passing the peace as we normally do with American Sign Language. And that goes like this. Peace be with you and also with you. Thank you. Please be seated. I will go ahead and start us this morning as we begin our worship with a word of prayer. So if you'll join me in prayer, please. Dear Creator and Life Giver, we thank you this day for bringing us together to be your people. We ask that you open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to the stories of all your people. No matter how or where those stories begin, whether they follow the same stories we have all heard and been taught over the years, or they are a different version of your love in this world, from a different perspective and different culture, open us to these stories. It is by us knowing and loving all your people and being transformed by the messages we all have to share in our stories that make us your people. Please bless this time of discovery and discussion together so we can hear and learn as you would want us to. Amen. There's a couple scripture verses that I'll share here in just a moment that really cover and hit on our theme this morning. And those scripture verses are John chapter 8, verse 32. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And the second scripture, theme for today comes from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. For we are members one of another. As some of you may know, a large group of us here at United Faith Community attended a conference-sponsored event called a Sacred Sites Tour last Sunday afternoon. I would like to begin my message today by reading to you all the letter written in our weekly Minnesota UCC conference newsletter by our conference minister, Reverend Sherry Prestman. It was titled, it was titled, The Power of Story and Truth Telling, and it is about the event from last week. Excuse me. Story. Our faith would be nowhere without it. Our biblical narrative is filled with the stories of our ancestors in faith. From the creation accounts, through the prophets' proclamations, to the teaching of Jesus, and on to the apostles' letters, we are drenched in the stories of those who have gone before us. We find in those stories testimony of those who struggled and lost, met with injustice, occasionally doubted, and yet persevered in faith. We discover truths about our human capacity to hurt, to heal, and to sustain hope. The lessons of these ancient stories still shape and inform our faith today. Story can transform us. On last Sunday afternoon, 30 conference members gathered to hear other sacred stories. Led by Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, co-director of racial justice at the Minnesota Council of Churches, and Reverend Kelly Sherman Conroy, a native theologian and PhD student at Luther Seminary. We sojourned to 3 different sites in the Twin Cities area that hold powerful meaning for Indigenous people in Minnesota. As Jim Bear and Kelly narrated our experience, we heard about treaties with Native peoples that were ignored and were unjust in the first place. The complicity of the Christian church in oppressing and harming Indigenous peoples, the U.S.-Dakota War and execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, the concentration camp where women, children, and elderly Indigenous people were held and died, and sacred burial grounds at Pilot Knob that were desecrated. These are stories central to the Indigenous experience, marked by brutality and broken promises, as well as by resilience and strength. They are stories we must know and confront as Minnesotans, as Americans, and as Christians. In 2019, delegates to the annual meeting of the conference approved a resolution entitled Racial Justice Through Reparations, calling on the Minnesota Conference member churches and congregation members to make meaningful efforts to repair the historic and sinful violations that perpetuate white privilege today. There are multiple ways to engage in such repair. Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs told us on Sunday that one small step in this work is doing exactly what we were doing, receiving the stories of others and opening ourselves to confession and transformation in doing so. Hearing and receiving the stories of our Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, making room for truth-telling, and allowing those testimonies to shape our future ministry is part of the work we're called to as a courageous church, alive with Christ's transforming love. We proxy that in facing the truths of our past, we won't repeat such harm and sin in the future. What stories might there be in your community that need to be heard? What can you learn from the testimony of those whose experience has been vastly different from your own? What relationships do you need to build in order to create sacred space for hard truths and stories to be shared and honored? As Christians, we know the profound power of story to shape the faith we proclaim. I urge all of us to seek out the hidden stories all around us, sacred testimonies of our communities and people of color. Their stories can teach us what we need to hear and strengthen our witness as a courageous church, committed to repairing what's been broken. I thank Reverend Sherry Prestman from the Minnesota Conference for writing this article and sharing with all of us what the Sacred Sites Tour meant to her and us. As I began today, I noted that several of us attended this Sacred Sites Tour last weekend, and I am certain we each were transformed in different ways from the stories that were shared. I would like to share with you all some of the things that struck me most from the opportunity of receiving those stories. I will also ask and encourage others to share things that they took away and pondered since our time with Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs and Reverend Kelly Sherman Conroy. The stories that they shared with us it was very graphic and very hard stories to listen to. But there was something that stuck out to me, and that's what I'm going to share. And as I had mentioned, I will give others opportunity as well to share what they took away from it and the stories that were most impactful to them. So one of the ideas shared by Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs was that stories are often contained by time. We hear stories of slavery and think of them as many years ago. So we are able to separate ourselves from them by time. That happened way back then, so it doesn't pertain to me. We can disconnect from it. I actually had somebody say, I was telling them about this sermon that I was going to give today, and they had said to me, they've had people say, slavery was 300 years ago. That's so long ago, let it go. Well, if you think about the age of people, say they live around 100-ish, that's only 3 people. That's only three people ago. It's not that far back. But anyways, the conquering of land from indigenous people took place long ago, and I had nothing to do with that. I can separate myself with time from those stories. Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs and Reverend Kelly Sherman Conroy explained in several of their stories, though, how indigenous people don't see stories in a timeline and separate themselves from stories with time, like many of us do. Reverend Kelly Sherman Conroy shared a story of her grandmother and grandfather, which was technically, I think she said her great-great-grandmother, or multiple greats in there. But she doesn't disconnect that way. So when she talks about this person and this story she was sharing, it's her grandmother. She doesn't, again, put that great, how far away was this from me? Because she knows that person is impacting her. But so she doesn't disconnect from them that way as a representation of how far apart they are in time. She had us pick up a stone in the place where we were meeting at Fort Snelling. The stone brought her connection to the people who have been in that same place over generations. The place of creation for Lakota and Dakota people is where we were at Fort Snelling. This is their Garden of Eden, and women would walk for days from villages far, far away to come to that place and give birth. She spoke of how her and Reverend Jim Bear Jacob spoke of how they would come there, and it was important that when they gave birth there, they were breathing in the air in that place of beginning of creation for them. They also then went on to tell us that this place turned into a concentration camp, as Sherry described, where there were many people that died and suffered in that same place. Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs shared the story of how Minnesota came to be a state and the requirement of white men to qualify, which is how so many German and Scandinavian white men came to live here and farm the lands. I think it was 100,000? I forget the number. But there was some quantity required that you had to have that amount of white men living in the territory in order to turn it into a state.
I think it was 7,000.
Was it 7,000?
I
Okay.
think so.
Yeah, it was some number of that. And as he shared this story, I thought of my family farm I have known my entire life, where my great-great-grandparents came to put down roots in the United States. I love that farm, and I feel connected to that place. I haven't been there in years, but I still feel connected to it. It's a place of my beginning. I fear the day that homestead is no longer in our family. As I listened to the story of how their Garden of Eden was turned into a place of death and despair from the stories they shared, and tried to imagine how it would feel to be in that place. I also thought about that farm, our family farm, and the cost. I had never thought of that us putting this farmstead up and my family was at the cost of somebody else. And now thinking about that cost sort of turns my perception a little bit of it, but I still think of it as a place that I love because it means a lot to me. But when I then think of that cost to others, it makes the story different. It puts a different dynamic in it for me. And I imagine in a very, very different way, as they view that place that we were at in Fort Snelling as their Garden of Eden, but then for it to be turned into a place of death as those concentration camps. And I think of how hard that must be to have a place be something so beautiful and yet so painful at the same time. There is still such a connection and love, though, even with that pain. Our stories as white Americans is one of conquering a land for our own advantage. That is still part of our story, as is slavery, as is the destruction of our earth we are still doing today. We can try to use time as a way to separate ourselves from those histories, but they are part of us and where we are in this moment. God's desire for us to love one another is not just in this moment with the people right here that we know and see every day. We also need to find out how we can be the love in this world to right the wrongs of the past. Hear the stories of others and learn from them. Seek out more knowledge about the past and how we still benefit from those things today. What do you do what do we change right now and here because we are still reaping those benefits? How do we make that right? I think of that story of our family farm, and the cost of others that I'm where I am because of that beginning for my family. If it wasn't for them there, I wouldn't be here. So I still get the benefit of them having this land to farm and take, and build up the family that we had. And so I have to think about how do I let that be part of my history and bring that into who I am and know that I need to find ways to repair that damage that's there. It's not somebody else's problem. It's my problem. I can't separate from it. So there are many other stories that were shared, and I'd like to give those here that attended a chance to share the stories of transformation they heard. So if anybody wants to share something that they took away, that'd be wonderful.
One thing that really struck me is, and you use this term, but I've never heard it put in the terms of a concentration camp. When the Dakota women and children and elders were marched to Fort Snelling, they built a fence and they locked them into, they said basically 2.5 acres, 1,700 people. Many of you have been to my home, you know what, we have 3 acres. Imagine 1,700 people at our house. It's amazing. But the other thing about calling it out as a concentration camp is that I then went to equating it to what happened in Germany. And I thought, man, as a society, we were taught about the Holocaust and the concentration camps in Germany, and culturally and socially, we immediately think this is just this horrible, horrible thing. We don't go there when we were taught about this, what happened with the Dakota people in 1862. We don't have that same sense of horror and how awful it really was. And I think that's part of the problem, is we should be just as horrified at what happened in Minnesota at that time with the Dakota people as we are with what happened with the Jews in Europe. And unfortunately, part of that fault comes back to the church. The church did not call it out. No different than Germany, where many people in Germany did not call out what was happening, what the Nazis did. Many people kind of went along with it, and, well, it's not my problem, even though it was in the same time. Many people just, oh, it's not my problem. I can't do anything. I'm just look the other way. So, in one sense, something I've thought about this week is, given that, I find it pretty amazing that our 2 Dakota, native presenters are Christian. Even though it would be very easy to blame the Christian church and turn your back on Christianity, they still have chose to follow Jesus, the way of Jesus, and embrace Christianity. And that gives me hope that Christianity is a hopeful promise if we trust in Jesus and we truly follow his ways. But it also brings me despair to think that the church in many ways falls so far from what Jesus calls us to.
Thank you. Others want to share?
For me, it was very spent a lot of time listening, trying to digest the information and put myself in that story. Because it is something that, like Jim Bear Jacobs was saying about the distance of time, and I kept thinking about that throughout that was, similar to how it affected Shelley, it also impacted me. I kept thinking about the circle of time and how we all have an impact in our own way on today, right now, and even if it's a small impact, it is still an impact. The thing that, that was kind of the main thing that I kind of pulled out of it, as well as just that visual that there was one point where the 38 men were killed in Mankato, and how Jim Bear Jacobs kind of mentioned that was done within 48 hours of the Emancipation Proclamation, or the freeing of Black people, but at the same time, we just killed 38 Native Americans. So there's, I think that's a truth that we do not acknowledge in any way. We whitewash our history as much as we can. That is done intentionally in schools and through our curriculums. And I think that makes that's definitely something that we need to address. And because those stories are important, they're people. And I really thought that the other piece that I've heard, maybe not so much here at this one, but at others, is we focus so much on our rights, whereas Native Americans and others, it's their obligations. And I think that just changes the whole tone, the perspective so much when we look at it in that way, because rights make it sound like everything's about me, whereas obligations is how I'm helping others. And I think that that's really important to tell those stories, because we don't know a truth that we are not told.
I think one of the very interesting parts of the story that Jim Bear Jacobs shared on those 38 men that were killed in Mankato, there was so much that he shared in that story. Of the list had started with 300 men that were on the list, and at the time the president had to give the approval to do the execution. And when he was given that list of 300 names, he said, no, get this down to a reasonable amount. I can't execute 300 men. And the reason wasn't a moral, I can't do this. The reason was, I have to keep going further west and make more treaties with Native American people and indigenous people. And if I show up there and have executed 300 men, they won't make a deal with me. I can't get any more of their land. And that was the reason why it went down to 38 men instead of 300. It was because we wanted more land and needed the ability to negotiate with them. And so to think 38 is the acceptable number that they got to. That story was really moving. And then I think the other part about it as well as when they were walking those, because those, if I remember the story correctly, they were at Fort Snelling in the same place. They were walking these men, or kind of that area, walking these men down to Mankato, or maybe it was walking the women back up to the concentration camp. But as they marched them through town, people would pull them out and, beat them, throw rocks at them. And it was just such a difficult story to hear. But I think, as you say, Ash, we have to connect to those and know that that is part of who we are. It is part of our history and a part of our story as well. Thank you for sharing.
And I think Ash used the right term about our history, and it was whitewash. Literally whitewash it. Make it less embarrassing is the term I've used in talking about this week to other people. As a white person, I was embarrassed by what I was hearing. I've always had an interest in history, especially local history. And there were so many facts that I learned that afternoon that I didn't know about. And it was detailed type of things. I knew that they had marched a bunch of the Native Americans from their settlements in Mankato to Fort Snelling. I did not know that it was only essentially women, children, and elderly people. I didn't know that they made them do that 100-mile walk in 6 days in November in Minnesota. And then they set them up into this concentration camp, as it's been referred to, in November. And really didn't make a lot of provision to help them out. The other thing is when they kicked the Native Americans out of that Fort Snelling area and quote unquote relocated them to that Mankato area along the Minnesota River, the state or the federal government made no provision. They just said, here you go, there's where you're going. But when they get there, there's already white settlers farming that land. This land that they supposedly had now given to Native Americans. So there's all of these things that are these small details that none of us were taught in school, in our Minnesota history classes. Yes, we heard about the hanging of the people. We heard about the Sioux Uprising, as it was termed. And the fact that they killed white settlers and things like that. But you didn't hear the details about how we responded to it. Most people don't hear the details about why that started. When the treaty was signed with the Native Americans, they were promised, I believe it, he said it was $300,000. And that's $300,000 in 1860 money, not today's money. That was a lot of money. But by the time it all came down to the very end, that $300,000 had been reduced to 60,000. Was that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
And that was to be spread out amongst all of those people. And then it was done in payments, monthly payments. And then our federal government, because they were fighting the Civil War, didn't have the extra cash to give back to those Native Americans when they were supposed to, even though those people depended on that for survival. Then those payments from the federal government were late. And if all of us know somebody that's on Social Security, imagine what the reaction would be from the American people today if the federal government, and we came close to it this last week, if the federal government suddenly was late with Social Security payments to citizens. There would be a riot, there would be a civil war. People would not, I mean, you'd have people running out of money right and left. But yet, because it was Native Americans, it was not a big issue. Oh, well, we'll get it to them next week, or something like that, so that they could buy food to feed their families and things like that. There were just so many of those type of details that even if somebody who has read a lot of history, I never read about those. And like I said, I've literally was embarrassed as a white person as to these truths coming out now. And what were, was it me? No. Was it my relatives? No. Are we responsible? You bet we are. Do we, does that mean we're supposed to give cash and give it back to the Native Americans? I don't know that that's the answer. I don't know that that would be what they necessarily want. But they get so ignored. And like Sharon talked about, what happened in Germany in the 30s was an atrocity to the American people. But what happened to the Native Americans over a century, no big deal. Sorry, that attitude doesn't cut it. And unfortunately, as a Christian community, and that's part of what tonight's documentary presentation's about, is we'll find out and we'll learn how the Christian church's involvement in these type of dealings goes all the way back to the 15th century. And, it's been that way ever since. And sometimes we as Christians put our blinders on and try to look the other way.
Thank you for sharing. So the last place that we visited during this tour was Pilot Knob. Kind of what did they call it? It like stuck out on a hill, so it was sort of looked like a knob. So that's how it got its name, Pilot Knob. But this place for the indigenous people was, it had a different name, and it really meant a hill much visited, which was a burial ground. Pilot Knob was a burial ground for the indigenous people. And how the tour concluded is we went to this place and we were sitting on a tar road. I don't think it was like a typical tar road size, but it was a tarred, road. And on one side was a church as we think of it, with a cemetery. And then on the other side was this grassy, wild vegetation area, that is Pilot Knob. And that is this hill much visited. And the story for that last place that we visited, that Jim Bear Jacobs and Sherry had, or Kelly had shared, was that that site used to be built up way higher than it was. There was way more dirt there. And what we had done over the years, I think it was in the beginning of the 1900s, sometime earlier, we were stripping dirt away from that hill for the developments and things that were being developed in the area. And they would do that, and they would dig out the dirt, they would find bones, because this is where indigenous people had buried all of their relatives over the years. They would dig up the dirt, and they would find these bones, and they'd built a shed on that space, and they called it the bone shed. And so whenever they would be digging, they would grab those bones, if they found bones, they'd grab those bones and just throw them in the bone shed. Oh, just throw them in the bone shed. Oh, just throw them in the bone shed. And eventually there came to a point where they were going to make a plan of putting up condos on that land. There were a couple of white women who helped lift up the concern and raise the concern up so that it stopped that development. But it was jarring to know that we were sitting right next to a cemetery for white people, is the best way to say it, right? And then a cemetery for indigenous people. And it was completely acceptable to build condos on this cemetery. But not, it would be, if somebody went in there and said, well, we need this dirt in this cemetery, we're just gonna start digging dirt up. Oh, forget about, you just move these stones away and don't worry about the people and the bones. That would never happen. It would never, ever happen. People would be in an absolute uproar. You can't just take dirt from the cemetery because you need dirt. But to your point, Ole and Sharon, there isn't an uproar. There isn't, oh my gosh, what in the world are we doing? It is, oh yeah, just throw it in the bone shed.
Mhm.
And again, those stories that you just don't know and think, wow, how do I not know that? So, I want to thank everybody for sharing their stories. I want to thank everybody for being here today. And so just as a closing, as Ole mentioned, tonight there is that film showing of the Doctrine of Discovery at 7 p.m. at the Buffalo Presbyterian Church. And I would encourage all of you to attend if you're able to, so that hopefully you can hear the stories of others that may help transform you as well. So I thought I'd finish by telling a little bit about that Doctrine of Discovery. So what is the Doctrine of Discovery? The doctrines of Christian discovery originate with 15th century papal bulls that were issued by the Vatican and implemented by monarchies, sanctioning the brutal conquest and colonization of non-Christians who were deemed enemies of Christ in Africa and the Americas. These papal bulls were a continuation of what had been going on since at least the 8th century, from Charlemagne through the Crusades, the Inquisition, the War on Witches, to the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1823, the Doctrine of Discovery was first articulated as a legal formulation in U.S. Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. As this case fundamentally defines international property law today, it continues to be used by multinational corporations and nation states in their extraction of resources in indigenous territories around the world. The global scale with which the Doctrine of Discovery expressed itself in the Age of Discovery, first in Africa, then the Americas, and beyond, created a unified Christendom which became the oppressing force against the great global plurality of cultures. This doctrine governs United States and international law today and has been cited as recently as 2005 in the decision City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. So I want to just share again quickly those questions that Sherry had in her article this week to close and have that in your mind, and you can reflect on that even if you aren't able to attend this film. Just some ideas for you to reflect on as we close today. So what stories might there be in your community that need to be heard? What can you learn from the testimony of those whose experience has been vastly different from your own? What relationships do you need to build in order to create sacred space for hard truths and stories to be shared and honored. Thank you for being with us today, and may the stories you hear transform you as well.